Okay, welcome to our final live Collaborate session where we're going to discuss Assessment 2, our group task. We have got Nairi, Helen and Kathy's going to try and join us as well, and myself here to go through the assessment in a bit more detail. The whole aim of tonight really is just to clarify some of the areas of the assessment that are causing some questions and some clarification on our discussion boards, and just to make sure you're all feeling really, really comfortable with the task and make sure all your questions are answered. So we're going to go through each of the parts to the assessment. We're also going to go through how to submit your assessment, because I know lots of questions have come up on my discussion boards about how you put it all together and which bits everyone has and how you sort out your group from your individual components and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully we're going to clarify that for you. We're also lastly then going to look at the rubric, any supporting resources, and then looking at the whole concept of extensions, because in general we're not going to be offering too many beyond the 48 hours because it's a group task and that makes it complicated, as well as the fact that it's towards the end of the teaching period. So we do need to get these in and meet deadlines. So it has been great to see some of you have a go at the word search. Did we get all of them done? Oh my gosh, I think we did. Oh, I can move on. Yay. Alrighty. So let's get started. Each of the ELAs is going to be going through different parts of the task. We thought we'd all have a go of tipping in and getting things sorted and giving you a range of different ideas and approaches. And Kathy's going to be manning the chat for us. So let's move on to our next slide. Okay, about assessment 2. So this is our team assignment, and you should all be in a team by now. If there is anyone who has not been allocated a team, please contact your ELA ASAP so that they can organise something for you. Waiting till the day before and suddenly realising it's a team assessment is not going to do you any favours, and it's going to be quite tricky for us to sort something out. So please make sure you know which team you're in. It's been great to see on our discussion board so many teams getting themselves sorted, coming up with timelines and deadlines where each of you have certain parts to submit. I know on my discussion boards it's been really good seeing the range of ways that you're all communicating, from Google Docs. Some of you are having some Skype sessions, others are emailing bits and pieces. Some of you are using the threads on the discussion board. It's been really great to see you use a whole range of different elements of technology and different platforms to communicate with each other. Before we get started, I really want to emphasise the importance of active communication with your group. I know those groups that are absolutely flying ahead and feeling quite comfortable with the task are those groups that are actively communicating. So they're corresponding with each other frequently, sending emails, posting comments on the discussion board threads, basically just keeping everyone in the loop. That is the key to enjoying this experience and to using this experience as a positive collaborative effort. I think the big issue arises when groups are not communicating actively, because silence stresses people out. It causes everyone to get a bit bothered and start to worry, have they left the unit? Are they not able to access the internet at the moment? What's going on? Are they still going to meet the deadlines? So the crickets that you hear when you send off an email to your team really start to get the stress bottling up and increasing. So please, 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 I can't stress enough the importance, especially in these final weeks, of active communication with your group. If you're having trouble meeting a particular deadline, don't try and sort of sit there and hide away in your study at home thinking it doesn't matter, I'll just keep busying myself and no one's going to notice. They will, and they'll really start to get concerned. Just shoot off a quick email to your team saying, look, something's come up, I'm not going to have it to you tomorrow, I'll have it to you the next day. Teams would much rather hear from you and hear that there's been an issue than not even know if you're going to be able to get your task done. Okay, and the key with this whole communication aspect is some of the components really rely on you chatting with each other, working through the part of the task, and making sure that you've all met original deadlines so you can move on, because you'll find it really challenging to move through the task if you haven't completed previous parts. So really I know all the other ELAs will be thinking the same thing. Active communication will be the key to you getting this task completed by the deadline and in you reducing your stress levels. So really try and get on board that. If you've been a bit out of the loop, get on board now and make sure you get in contact with your group and let them know where you're at. Okay, very quickly, I think we're all pretty familiar with the task in terms of the different components. This is just an overview here, and I am going to spend some time later breaking it down and looking at how you put it all together for your final report that you're going to submit. So firstly, we've got the analysis of the scenario, which is 600 words in total, and that's your team component. So that's where you're going to break down the scenario that you've been given, start looking at the issues that are arising from the scenario, and start looking at how the teachers are planning on approaching the issue, which is the fire at the coal mine, and how they're going to work around it, and whether you think they're using some 21st century teaching and learning approaches. The second part is the examination of new practices, partnerships and technologies, and you're each going to select your own ideas and then present them to the group as a 600-word piece, and so that's an individual task. You're then going to review and compare each of those new practices that everyone's come up with and come up with a team choice for which practices, partnerships and technologies you think are going to be the most effective to then deal with the issues you've identified in part one. So we want to see some links. Okay, so whatever points you identify in part one, we want to see that you've addressed them in part three with your choices of practices and technologies and different partnerships. The last written part is your reflection, which is individual, and I think it's really, really important that we stress that no one else sees this but yourself and your ELA who's marking it. So you can be as honest and as open as you need to be, remembering to still be, constructive and formal in your response. That part is the only part of the task that can be written in first person. Everything else needs to be in third. Okay. Your reference list, there are two parts to this. Your group reference list, so that's the references that you've used for part one and part three. And then you will have an individual reference list, which are additional references that you would have used for parts 2 and 4. Okay, so there's two headings for that section. And then lastly, your record of collaboration, maximum of 2 pages. This isn't in your word count, so it doesn't add to the 2,200 words plus or minus 10%. And really, this is just so we can see how you've collaborated, how you've put it all together. And I'm going to go through that in a bit more detail because I know that there's been a few questions based on that. You are to make 1 submission each. So just like with assessment 1A and 1B, you each submit your own Word document. Okay, so it's not that you submit 1 document for your whole team. Every single team member submits their own document through Turnitin, like you have done with the other 2 assessments. Okay, and I will go through in lots more detail in the later part of the collab session exactly how you set everything out. And this is worth 40% of your mark. Okay, moving on then, and I'll answer questions in a second. I just sort of want to set the scene for what we're going to be going through. The whole point of this assessment is to start to apply what it is that we've been learning over the last 10 weeks and some of the ideas that have come out from our essay, so 1A and 1B, and put it into a real life scenario. So this whole assignment is really a 21st century teaching and learning approach in itself. Okay, we're trying to get you to work through some collaboration, some communication, getting you to be a bit creative in the ideas that you're coming up with, getting you to analyse and critique and use some critical thinking skills. So we're using our 4 C's in this actual assessment task. So we're getting you to put into practice some of the things that you've been learning over the last 10 weeks. Remember, 21st century teaching and learning approaches use real life. They don't just use theory or ideas or let's pretend. They actually use real life situations to make things real, to make it appropriate, to make it relevant. And that's exactly what we're doing here. Okay, so we're trying to, as a team, look at a report based on the scenario, which is the primary school. You're going to be comparing and contrasting traditional teaching and learning with new practices, new technologies, external and internal partnerships to look at how the teaching and learning can be enhanced for the students of this primary school. Okay, as I said earlier, every part of the report is in third person except for the reflection. If you want to write the reflection in third person, you most certainly can, but it's okay if it's in first. Okay, I think these ready orangey unit learning outcomes are really, really important because I think they start to make the assessment real, and I think they start to address also some of the questions that we've had about each of the parts to the task. Through this task, we're asking you to compare and contrast traditional teaching and learning practice with new learning practices. So looking at 20th century compared to 21st. So we want to consider the 20th century ideas that are being suggested by one of the teachers in the case study, and then start to consider what we could do differently to implement some of these new practices, these new 21st century teaching and learning approaches to the scenario, so that the students and the community as a whole learn from the experience, benefit from the experience, and get the most out of the experience. We're looking at an examination of new technologies for teaching and learning, and we're also explaining how curriculum and pedagogy is changing in the 21st century. So a lot of these unit learning outcomes are very familiar because we've already looked at them in quite a bit of detail in Assessment 1A and 1B. The new part to it is looking at the importance of internal and external partnerships in education. So this is a slight addition to what we've looked at in our previous two assessments because we haven't covered this before. Okay, so this really gives you the key information as to the what that you need to be exploring and discussing in your report. Okay, and what we're going to do is start to break down each of the parts of the assessment so you can see how these unit learning outcomes link to those different parts. I really think the key to this assessment is seeing that this is a way you can show us what you've taken from the course, and if this was your primary school that you would be working in at that year 2 level, what would you do to start to implement some 21st century teaching and learning approaches if they were your students? What have you taken from the unit? What ideas, what new practices, what different types of technology, what partnerships do you think would be useful to create a successful teaching and learning program for these students? Before I move on, are there any questions? I think the great thing about this task is it is so 21st century because it puts together so many of the ideas that we've been discussing each week and looking at in our previous assessments. So it's really getting you to apply what you've learned rather than just write an essay and tell us all the theory and all the ideas behind it. It's actually getting you to look at what might be appropriate for this situation. So you might find some of the ideas we've looked at are not going to be relevant here, or you might find you need to expand and explore and elaborate a little bit more on just the general ideas. So really focus on what you think is going to address the needs of these students at this time. Okay. All right, we are going to move on. I think I'm handing over to Nairi now to discuss the scenario. So I will switch off my mic. Were there any questions, sorry, by the way? No, we're all good? Okay, I'll hand over to Nairi then.
Thanks, Dani. I actually think Alex had a question. So do you want to ask a question, Alex?
Thank you, I do. The 600 words in section 2 that we're collating, obviously we'll have, and I've had that clarified in the chat box, we'll have, say in a team of 3, you'll have my own personal wording, my 2 teammates' wording. Is it proper or accepted that, because I know in a team environment, and I've worked for a few years, if I was doing something like this and someone gave to me something that isn't really good, it was their personal work and it maybe needed some grammatical corrections or something just didn't look right, are we permitted to give advice to our teammates on their personal contribution? I think that's probably the easiest way to put the question. Is that acceptable, or is that looking at sort of collusion? Or
Okay.
Oh, sorry, you go, Nairi.
Sorry, Dani. Well, I think the section 2 is an individual task. So correct me if I'm wrong, Dani, but each student would, so each of you would submit the team sections, but then for the individual section, you only submit your own.
Yep, in Beck's flipped collaborate, she's asked that each team submit each of the responses to part 2. In the past, you've only submitted your own. But what we're asking for this time is, say the 4 ELAs were in a team. So in my submission, I would put mine first and I'd say part 2, Dani's response, and include mine. Then I'd have Kathy's response and include a copy of hers, then Helen's response and a copy of hers, and then Nairi's response and a copy of hers. Okay, I think, Alex, your question is more before you submit, are you able to offer each other feedback? The answer is absolutely. If when you're looking at each other's work, if you can see that there might be something that that person might need to change about a structure of a sentence or something like that, you can most definitely be constructive and helpful. Just make sure you're being really positive in how you say it, because you don't want to, you know, squash them. But if you've noticed something that could do with a little improving, by all means do it. In that second section, you are only marked on your response. So if someone else's work, you know, it doesn't matter about the other people's work in your team, for that section only, your mark is not going to be impacted because I'm only going to be reading yours. Okay, so if Beck was marking all of ours for my submission, she would mark my part 2 response for me. She would mark Kathy's part 2 response for Kathy, Nairi's part 2 response for Nairi, and so on. Okay, I am going to cover the submission process in a little bit more detail a bit later down, I think slide 11. But yeah, Alex, you can definitely help each other out. This whole task is about collaborative learning. So if someone's got a strength in writing, by all means use that so everyone benefits. If someone else has got a strength in referencing, use that referencing strength to help each other. So does that answer your question, Alex?
Yeah, no, that's made it very clear. No, that's fine. And that's how sort of real life would work. You know, you'd want to bring your teammates along with you, even though it's an individual component. But yes, no, it's not collusion. Okay, and no, that's good. Thank you.
No worries. Sorry, Nairi, I'll back out now and you can get back to your part.
That's okay. Thanks, Dani, and thanks for clarifying that too, because I've had a couple of questions around that as well. I think it's something that a lot of people are wondering about. So yeah, thank you for explaining that so clearly. That's great. We do have another question from Hayley. So I'll hand over to you, Hayley.
Hello.
Hi, Hayley.
Hi. Sorry, I didn't know if you could hear me. My question, I guess, is around what each of our individual submissions should look like. So what I'm asking is, do we each present a scenario of how we would like to proceed with addressing the 20th century or the 21st century teaching, and then submit those each, and then for the next section, which is, sorry, I'm a bit, so we then review and compare all 4 of our submissions. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
So everyone in your team, everybody's submission will look the same, but you each need to submit one for yourselves, if that makes sense. I think Dani's going to go through all the questions around the submission a little bit later. Yeah, did you want to hang on to the questions? Because some of them might actually be clarified as we go through.
No,
And I know,
well, my question is, I probably didn't word my question very well because it's not really about the submission. It's more about what the content of our individual part has to be. Because I assumed that each person would talk about a practice, a partnership, and a technology as one idea of how to approach the situation, and then we would compare it. But some of our group members, or another group member of mine, has said, no, we shouldn't all be talking about technologies because we might lose marks for doing that.
no, you're right. So everybody should be covering practice, partnership, and technology in their response.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And sorry I took up so much time and I didn't word the question very well at the beginning.
No, that's okay. No, it's okay. As long as we can clarify everything, and other people probably have the same question anyway.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Hayley. Okay, so thanks everyone. And feel free to ask questions because often other people do have the same questions and are wondering the same things. So thanks for those questions. Okay, so we're going to move on and have a look at the scenario. I think all of you have looked through the scenario and you're very familiar with it, so I'm not going to read through it all. But we're going to have some interactive learning at the moment. So we're going to share some ideas as well for this section of the Collaborate, and it's going to help us build our ideas for our assessment. So the scenario analysis that we're going to start on now is covering the first section of the assessment. So here we've got the scenario, so we know that there's been a fire at the coal mine, and then we're presented with a few different ideas for how the school can approach some discussion around this for the students. So we've got, this is actually quite indicative of what would actually happen at a school. So you would have teachers at varying stages in their teaching career or even in their practice of 21st century pedagogies. So you have a teacher who is thinking, I guess, more along the traditional lines, and then a teacher who's wanting to think a little bit more open-minded about the task. So we're going to think about the task of identifying potential issues with traditional teaching and learning practices, and then we're going to think about the new teaching and learning practices that will help the learning. And we're also going to look at how we can enhance the learning and look at how we can address those concerns that Ms. Newcomb has around the wellbeing of students and probably explore that a little bit further. So the activity that we've got on this slide is to circle or underline the keywords or sentences in the scenario that will help you address the assignment tasks. So what part of the scenario do you really need to identify that's going to help you break down this assignment? Great, excellent. Okay, so I can see that we're identifying community, and that's actually a really important point because that links really strongly in with the discussion around partnerships. So we need to be thinking about how the school can make effective partnerships and meaningful partnerships to address the issues around the children's wellbeing. Okay, so we've circled a different approach. That's good. So in our analysis, we'll be thinking about what that different approach could be. And we've also underlined there the well-being. We've also, some people have identified the science project, the fact that it's grade 2. That's good because that actually has an impact on the types of learning that would happen, and also possibly some ideas that the teachers might think students may not be prepared or mature enough to deal with some of the issues around the fire. Okay. Is there any other areas that we needed to look at? Oh, we've underlined the teachers, which is good, and also the principal as well. So the principal had some ideas too. And I think it's important that somebody's underlined the effects of the fire on the town as well, because we are looking at the students and their well-being, but also that broader sense of the town. Okay, you'll just have to excuse me for a moment too, because I'm going to take some screenshots of what we're doing here, and we'll share them on our discussion boards a little bit later. Okay. Okay, so we'll move along. Okay, I can see we've had a question there that we're only talking about grade 2 level, and yes, that's right. So because they are focusing in on the grade 2 class, we want to make sure that the approaches are appropriate for that year level. Okay, so here we come to the first section of your assessment, which is the analysis of the scenario. So this section is a team task, and Dani might touch on this a little bit later, but I just wanted to say that I've noticed in some of my groups, some of the teams, that some people are suggesting that they each go and write 150 words each, and then they'll just kind of put them together, which can actually be a really good strategy. But don't forget too that it's actually good to start off with some kind of collaboration to get some ideas together, so that you're not going away and writing 150 words about the same thing, and then you come back together and you realise that you've actually got quite a narrow discussion. So just make sure that while you can write 150 words each, it's really useful to have that starting point of brainstorming the ideas together, just so we get a really broad discussion and a discussion with some depth. Okay. So here we've got some of the potential issues with traditional teaching and learning. So what can you see in the scenario that are traditional teaching and learning practices, and what are the issues that those pose for the 21st century learning that we're trying to achieve? Excellent. I can see that we've probably had some really good discussions in our teams about this already. So we've got some good ideas that have come out straight away. Yeah. Okay, so we've got the talking at the children, chalk and talk, one size fits all. Okay, the transmission style of teaching. Okay, and I think around that we've probably, there are different elements in that scenario that could be fitting that, but particularly if you focus in on that talk from the firemen, that could actually be a really useful session to have. However, it's how it's being used. So excellent. So someone's got here the shallow learning, passive recipients. That's right. So I'm kind of being talked at. So need to think about some ways that the students then can be more interactive in that session. And also with writing the story after, there is a focus on the well-being of the students. So just writing a story, does that really tap into how they are feeling and the emotions that they experience around this? And we also need to consider the use of technology as well. So there's lots of apps, as we know, and programs that could be used to enhance the learning and make sure that all the different learning styles are being catered for. Okay, let's have a look at the issues. Yeah, so bored, disengaged. We need to remember that the children are emotional, and they are at year 2 level as well. So they're scared. So that could actually be an issue, but it could also work in favour of some of these practices as well. So in your analysis with your team, we want you to look at these potential issues and explain this, be really specific in your analysis. So what are the specific elements that those teachers are trying to use that would pose those issues? Okay, so we can discuss, that the children are passive, but what is it exactly that's making them a passive learner? And also we need to look at some of the positives as well in that analysis. Okay. And you might also, in your analysis, bring Miss Newcomb into this and discuss what is it exactly that you think she might be looking for. Okay, so you could actually do that as an extension of those potential issues. You could then provide a comparison or start to bring in some of those ideas that Miss Newcomb's trying to move away from the learners being passive recipients or the task not being individualized. Okay, and we'd also need to discuss the why. So why would the children be disengaged, and why may they act out? Why could they be experiencing some anxiety issues, and why is that not focusing on through these traditional teaching and learning practices? Okay, is there any questions at this point around that first section of the assessment? I'm just going to take a screenshot. No, we're all okay to move on. Okay. Okay, thanks, Jason. Excellent. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Helen, who's going to take us through the next couple of slides, and then I'll be back soon. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Thanks, Nairi, and thanks, Dani. Okay, I can see a few little yeses over in the box, so I'll just continue on. So what I'm going to be looking at is the section that both Dani and Nairi have talked about, and there's actually been some questions about tonight as well, which is the section that is the individual task. So this is the one where you're examining new practices, partnerships and technologies for teaching and learning. So we're going to have a bit of a brainstorm again on our little red box down the bottom, where we're going to be looking at the technologies and the partnerships both within the school, the internal ones, and the external partnerships in the community as well, since this scenario has affected the entire community. So in the little red box, using a colour other than red, what sort of things have you been talking about in your groups, or have you been writing about individually, so that we can put these together and just have a bit of a brainstorm so that we've got a bigger pool to choose from? Well, I like some of these ones that are coming up here, emojicons. I like the concept that this is relating to the Year 2 students. But don't forget that to keep in your mind the clientele of the group that you're teaching or Miss Newcomb's teaching when you're looking at these new technologies, the new teaching practices, the learning practices that the students will be engaged in, and things that will be helping to support both the teaching and the learning in this context, which is not something that was planned, but as we all know in teaching, not everything is planned. The online science projects relating to the fire, I think that was talked about in the scenario, and I like the concept of expanding on that. So how could we be linking in the partnerships with internal and external parties within that? That'd be probably something that would be worth exploring. definitely the use of buddies and partnering up. I think that was mentioned as well. The younger students and the older students is a really good concept. Definitely project-based learning, very 21st century. Art therapy, certainly with the distress that the students in the community and the other students and teachers within the school as well will be experiencing that art therapy, probably even putting on plays. I can see over on the side there, very appropriate to the student's age as well. I'm looking for some more partnerships. Has anyone got any ideas about the different partnerships? We've got the fireman coming in. I like the YouTube and the connecting with the 21st century learning and the technology side of things. Perhaps even filming some of these activities and creating YouTube productions would be another way of sharing and connecting with the outside community. Inviting in the nurses and the social workers, the guidos, whether the school has a guido or the department provides a guidance officer to come in and help. That would be a really good that could be explored, and certainly each state would have a process around that that can be tapped into, and definitely an external partnership worth pursuing there. Definitely the local council. Okay, some really great ideas there. Nari, did you want to just take a screenshot of that one before we move on and have a look at just the next consideration? Oh, there's a few more coming on. Yes, Dani, I agree. It's really good to be considering the community element. There's quite a lot of community ideas that are coming up. Alex, did you have a question you wanted to ask at this stage?
Yeah, more of a bit of a sharing. I'll share with the other students here. I've been a serial collaborate attender over the last couple of nights. Something that came up when selecting these your new teaching practice or practices amongst your team, if you it was brought up, if you all picked the sort of same thing and they were quite closely related, it will be difficult to analyse and or more so compare them in the next section, which is section 3 coming up. I thought that was a really good point someone brought up. I just wanted to share that. So probably the more diverse, or if your teammates can use different approaches or practices, it will make section 3 probably a lot easier to do than if all pick, exactly the, everyone's picked up inquiry or something like that, or a particular type of app. That's all.
Absolutely, and thanks so much for sharing that, Alex. I think this is something that both Dani and Nari touched on earlier, that in collaborating with your group, even though you might be going off and working on separate areas, making sure that you have that brainstorming and the collective understanding of the different areas that you're going to be looking at. As Alex has pointed out, it's going to give you much more variety to explore. And as Nari pointed out, when you go into section 3, that's going to be really important as well. So the broader you have your topics, the more depth you can go into in all of those further on. Good point, Alex, and thanks for sharing that. Okay, have we got a screenshot of that one just before I move on there?
Yes. Yeah, I took it.
Excellent. Okay. Okay, so just another little brainstorm that we can have here. This is really looking at the next section where you're going to be reviewing and comparing. So this is actually a team task. So as a team, you're going to be looking at all the new practices, partnerships and technologies that you've researched individually. So like Alex said before, the more planning you put into task 2, the easier you will find task 3. So having that breadth of different experiences is certainly going to give you something to delve more deeply into. So the 3 areas that we're looking at are considering and comparing all of those new practices, partnerships and technologies that you've individually looked at, analysing those strategies, and then deciding what are the key recommendations that you're going to put forward out of that as one united group. So this one, just to refresh, is 600 words as a team. So let's have a think about some options and pop them up. I can see some already popping up there. What components are you going to look at either as a team or an individual, and how are you going to communicate with your team so that you develop a response that is not 3 or 4 different disjointed little bits popped together that don't cohesively form that 600 words, but it's really a shared response that reads when we read it as though it's come from one author. And what do you think some of those challenges to get to that point might be? So I can see they're connecting with each other. I suppose that could be a challenge or an opportunity. It depends on how you decide to look at that. Definitely posing questions, getting consensus, absolutely. Weighing up all the different ideas is a really great idea as well. I can see Google Docs there, and I know Dani was talking, and we've all seen in our different discussion groups the different experiences that people are having as they communicate. Certainly the Collaborate tools that are out there, there's quite a few face-to-face ones as well as written ones, and I know that they're being used in various ways by different groups. A class blog absolutely is a good idea. Someone's written time there. I'm assuming that probably means setting aside time to get together. I know that a lot of the teams in my groups are setting aside a time where they're actually all going to get together and have just a face-to-face chat, or at least voice-to-voice chat on Skype, which seems to be working quite well for them, and they seem to be able to knock over a fair few ideas really quite quickly that way as well. Definitely looking for the benefits and limitations to each of the suggestions, and that's been a theme that we've been looking at all the way through in this teaching period, is with every concept that we consider looking at both the benefits and the limitations. So don't forget to give that balance as well. Okay, that seems to be coming to an end on the contributions there. If you want to take another screenshot of that one so that we've got that we can put up as well, Nairi.
Yeah, all done, Helen.
Excellent. Thanks, Nairi. Okay, I think, Dani, am I handing back to you now?
I think this one's coming back to me now. I'll go through the reflection.
Cool.
Okay. Thanks, Helen. Thanks for going through those parts, and thanks for the questions as well from everyone. It's really important at this point that we do make sure that we're clarifying any of those questions that you do have. Okay. Reflection. I can see we've also already got some commentary up there. That's great. The reflection's actually a really good opportunity to really reflect, for want of a better word, on how well or how comfortable you actually feel with some of these 21st century approaches, because often we ask the students to do some of these things, but we need to experience them for ourselves first, just so that we can then actually have a bit of empathy for the students, and it also helps us to see any of the limitations before we actually start implementing some new strategies in our teaching. Okay, so when we come to the reflection in the assessment, this is an individual task. It is 400 words in length, and in this reflection, we'd really like you to focus on the teamwork aspect of this task. It's not a reflection on the content or how well you understood the task or the content. What just happened there? Something happened to all of the ideas that were down. So if you just popped in an idea and it got lost, can you just pop it back in for us? That'd be great. Oh, technology. This is one of the things, isn't it? One of the challenges, 21st century learning. That's okay. Yes, thank you. So this is reflection on the teamwork. So yes, we're talking about how we felt and also some of the challenges we experienced, some of the benefits, some of the things we did really well, perhaps even some of the things that surprised us in working as a team. So please don't base your reflection on how well you wrote this part of the task or how well you understood the scenario and how great it was to think of new approaches. We want to hear your reflections on the collaborative part of the assessment. Just while people are writing down some benefits and challenges, you can see there's a resource down the bottom here on how to write a reflective essay. Also in the week 11 modules, so in the learning materials, there is a link to a document, I think it's from the Uni of New South Wales, about how to write reflectively. I've had a look at this one, it's really good. It provides some really good things for you to think about. So when you're reflecting, how can you make connections back to the actual learning that's taking place in this unit? How does it connect to some of those ideas? So in your reflection, that actually gives you a way to work in some of your references. And so you might reflect back on some of the readings that we had about, even for the week, for week 11 learning materials, it might actually, you might actually be able to link to some of those ideas of teachers as leaders as well. And also in being a leader in the school, that you're able to be flexible in your learning and that you're always learning. Okay, there's a strong notion within that now that when you go out to teach, the idea is that teachers are always learning as well. We're not the knowers of all the knowledge and givers of all the knowledge. We're continuously learning. So that might actually be something that you could weave through your reflection. That's just one example. In your reflection also, you can write in first person. You might choose to write in third person. It doesn't matter, you do have that option in this section. So let's have a look at some of the benefits that we see from working in a team. Okay, so we can get some inspiration from other team members, being able to bounce ideas off one another, consolidate our learning, yes. Gain knowledge and skills, that's right, and that comes back to that question that Alex had earlier, that if you've got the strength in an area, share that with your team. And also ask for help. If you feel that there's an area that you need to improve, ask for help in that. And that's the way that we learn. Help one another with strengths and weaknesses, interact with one another, and the collaboration. Okay, well done. And some of the challenges. Okay, so this is actually a good one, all the team members contributing and missing team members. So that comes back to that active participation that Dani was discussing. It's really important. And in your reflection, you might actually reflect on the fact that some of your team members might have been silent, and then you might go into a discussion around why it is important to have active learning or active team members, and that active communication or open communication. And the time also, so also finding time that works for everyone. And there are some ways around that. So if you can collaborate through email, so that time may not be a factor, but then it also poses other issues as well about things taking a longer time to get done. And people who've never actually done this before. Also make connections to how you see that this could inform your teaching in the future. So while it's a reflection on something that's happened, you should be thinking forward as well about, well, how is this going to help me in my teaching practice? for myself and with my colleagues, but also in the classroom and what I expect of my students. Okay, I think we may, oh, sorry, Dani, you've got something to say?
Yeah, just following on from what you were saying, Nairi, about how this can inform your potential teaching for the future. Something I sort of want to draw us all back to with the aims of the assessment, which I talked about at the beginning of the session, and that is that this is a 21st century teaching and learning approach that we've put into practice here and we're getting you to go through. So start to consider some of that when you're analysing the task and how your group worked. How did you deal with those 4 C's? Did you find that they came out in the task? Did you find any of them more challenging or easier to work through? Did you find the collaboration aspect challenging? So try and link back to some of those aspects of 21st century teaching and learning that we've tried to incorporate into this task, because that will give you direct connections to some of the readings, and that will add huge depth to your reflection, because it goes from being just I found this task really challenging because of X, Y, Z, and these are the things I learned from it, to suddenly now being a real critical reflection of what we've been trying to get you to take from the task and from the unit. So it just takes it to that next level. So just consider that when you start putting your reflection together.
Thanks, Dani. Yeah, it's a really good point. And often people do ask about, how do I weave references through a reflection? And that is actually some really good information or some really good tips on how you can take it to that next level, as Dani was saying, and to get those references into your reflection. Okay, I'm going to take a screenshot of our ideas here, and then we'll move on because I'm just wary of the time. Okay, so here we're going to be looking at referencing your work. So when you're referencing, I think Dani discussed this earlier, you will have a section that collates all of the references for the team tasks, and then you'll have a section for each of your team members outlining for their individual sections the references that they have used. So you might have some doubling up of references here. So you might use in your individual sections some references that you used in the team sections. That's okay. It's okay to have them doubled up as long as we can see the team references and then the individual references. So when you're referencing throughout your assessment task, make sure you are including them in the text. So when you are writing, and make sure it matches the reference list at the end. It can be quite frustrating if you see something referenced in text and you think, oh, that's actually really interesting, that point. I'd like to go and have a look at that further, and then you can't find it in the reference list. So just really make sure you spend that time in matching up all of the references. And for this length of report, the idea is to have around 12 to 15 references in total. Okay, so that doesn't mean 12 to 15 for your individual section, as well as 12 to 15 different ones for your team tasks. Although that would be great. If you do that, then that's fine. Make sure it's in APA style. Yes, absolutely, Dani, you can have more than 15. Don't think, oh, I've already used up my 15, I can't put in any more. Absolutely. If you've done lots of reading, then include that. If that's informed your ideas, make sure you include those references. APA style, remember there is an APA style guide, which is really useful. I always have it bookmarked because it's really hard to remember all the different rules behind the referencing, so I constantly go and check. So just make sure you use that style guide because it's really useful, it's really simple and easy to use. Yes, and as always, try and expand your research to achieve that higher grade. And the support that we've got to help us, your tutor, if you'd like some some of your work to be reviewed and to receive some feedback. They're actually a really good resource there, and they have a really good turnaround as well. So the student portal has some good resources as well. Student advisors for some quick questions about referencing can be really handy, and also the ELAs, and making sure that you post any questions on the discussion board is really handy. And student coaches, they're great for all of your work habits and motivation. So get in touch with them too if you feel like you just need a bit of motivation and some strategies to keep you going. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Dani now, who's going to take us through the remainder of the slides. Thanks, Dani.
Okay, I'm not going to go through lots of this part because I'm really conscious of the time, and I've got a little bit more I want to go through. I think this slide is really good because it goes through some of the readings that you might find important for each of the parts of the assessment. So what have you read so far that will help you identify potential issues with traditional teaching and learning practices in the scenario? Weeks 1 to 6 have some great readings that go through that, and that will help support some of the ideas that you come up with. So those issues that we brainstormed earlier with Nairi, they will have some connections in the readings in weeks 1 to 6. And then weeks 7 to 12 really focus more on new practices, partnerships and technology for teaching and learning. So once you've written part 2, use some of those readings to then go back and add some depth and some academic strength to your writing. Okay, each of the modules have got full reference lists which are really helpful, but I find that this is a nice, quick, easy guide for you to, identify quite quickly where to head first to find some information. Also consider what you did as research for assessments 1A and 1B. So many of you put together some really great reference lists that access some amazing sources to add depth to your writing. So don't throw them out just because this is a completely different assessment. Consider them and use them. And because there's more than one brain working in this task, you can use each other's ideas then. So you might not have read a particular resource or not accessed it for 1A or 1B, but someone else used it or a couple of people in your group used it. So use each other's knowledge and all the work you've put in so far to help strengthen everyone's response for this. This really is the best part of this collaborative approach, in that you're putting all your brains together and you're using all of the ideas and the readings and the efforts you've put in so far to the unit to add to each other's learning. So don't waste that. I'm going to skip ahead though to the next slide. Okay, this is the evidence of collaboration. There's been a lot of questions about this, and really your evidence of collaboration is going to be very much based on how you have chosen to collaborate. And because each of the teams is going to be looking at slightly different ways, remember earlier I said it's up to you how your team decides to communicate. Some are using Google Docs, some are using Skype, some using email, some are using the threads on the or the forum on the discussion board. It is completely up to your team how you want to communicate. Therefore, it's going to determine how you show that to us. If you've had a Google Docs approach, take a few screenshots of the communication you've used. Even email your ELA a link to the Google Doc, and they can go in and see the whole thing should they choose to, if they want further elaboration. Okay, if you have Skyped or used email, then you'll need to come up with a way to be able to show us your communication. If taking screenshots is a bit problematic, what we really need to see then is how your team has collaborated and how you have met with each other to discuss the key criteria. So we want to see some evidence of how the team broke up the tasks. So who was responsible for certain sections, how you put it all together. Was there one person in charge of reviewing and editing? Was there another person in charge of the final reference list? We want to see how you've managed to break the task down so we can see your team approach. We also want to see some evidence of you working to meeting timelines and deadlines and things like that, and your method of communication. So how have you managed to send each other information, how regularly have you communicated. So if you've got a massive Google Docs, we probably don't need to see the whole thing, just a few screenshots to show some evidence. It really is up to you. You might want to write a couple of sentences at the start just to provide an overview of how your team has communicated. So in Team 4, Kathy, Nairi, Helen and Dani communicated through Google Docs for sharing information and editing, as well as emails to discuss timelines, and then a couple of Skype sessions to further collaborate and break down the task, and then include some screenshots of some of the documents that you think are valid. The whole point of this evidence of collaboration is so we see how you worked as a team. Okay, so it really is up to you exactly what you include, but we just need to see how your team has worked together. Okay, and we can't be any more specific on this because each team has come up with really different ideas and different approaches, so it will be different for everyone. Okay, but we need to see how you worked as a team. Okay, I'm going to scoot ahead, and then there's a spot for questions at the end just because I'm really conscious of time, and I know for some of you you're going to have to leave fairly soon, and the submission process is one of the key things I want to go through, and that is next. Okay, there's been lots of questions on my discussion boards and in emails about how you put the whole assessment together. Now, Beck has created a report template that she's placed on our discussion boards in the Assessment 2 forum, but there were a couple of issues. Some people were finding that challenging to access, so I think it was Sunday she emailed it out to everyone. If you don't have a copy of that, I really strongly suggest either checking with the rest of your team or asking your ELA to help you out with it, because it is so clear. It is the most amazing document on how to put it all together. You basically save yourself a copy of that template and then copy and paste your responses and your team responses into each section. Okay. What you might consider doing is having one team response document that someone copies and pastes all the team responses into it, so it is all exactly the same for everyone in the team. When you're all happy with that, email it out to each other, and then all you do is save a copy of that and add your reflection and your individual reference list. That way it's guaranteed everyone's is the same. We need to make sure all the team sections are exactly the same for everyone in your team, okay? Because you're meant to be putting together a team response. What we don't want to see is, say, the 4 ELAs have submitted their work, and then when Beck goes to mark mine, she says that I've tweaked a few bits and pieces in some of the team sections. It's not a team submission then. It makes it change. It becomes very challenging to be able to mark it for us because it's meant to be exactly the same for everyone. Okay, so make sure once you've got your final submission, you're all happy with it and you're all ready to submit it together. Okay, so every single person in the unit will submit one document each, just like you did for 1A and just like you did for 1B. Okay, your one-word document will consist of the following. Firstly, before anything else, and this is left off of this this slide, you need a title page, and this is going to be super important for your ELAs when marking them because it's going to have the names of your team members. Okay, so on that title page you would need to have your team number, so team 3, team 4, whatever, your team members, so list the names of the members of your team, your own name, so then we're clear whose submission it is that we're marking, your student ID, just in case we need to follow up, the assessment number and title, and it's always really useful to throw in your ELA's name as well, just in case it disappears or something happens to it, and we can then track it down. Okay, so that title page should be the very first page, and it will be the same for everyone except for where you put your name and your student ID. Okay, so that title page is crucial because as ELAs, we're going to open up all team members in your team, all their submissions, and have a look at them all. So I will then be able to see that you've all done the same for the team task, and here's all your individual pieces, and it's all good and it all matches up. Okay, so by having all your team members on there makes life so much easier for your ELAs. Okay, so title page first, then you need to clearly label each part of the task. Headings and subheadings in this report are going to be crucial for your ELA, knowing where parts start and finish. So the first one is part 1, analysis of the scenario. That will be identical for all team members. So Kathy, Nairi, Helen and myself will all have exactly the same response, word for word. Part 2 will be your examination of new practices. You will need to post your individual task first. So I'll have Dani's response and then copy and paste my response in. Then it will be Nairi's response and her answer will be in there, then Kathy's and then Helen's, okay? Only your 600 words adds to your 2,200 words. We're not going to add all your team members in that, okay? And that's just so we can see it all together. We can see the different approaches, okay? Part 3 then, with that part 2, it's a good idea to put yours first. That way, when your ELA is marking it, they know that they can scroll straight down and they can see your individual section. So put yours first, okay? Part 3 is your review and comparison. That will be exactly the same for every single team member. So this is where you're going to analyse, compare and contrast the ideas you've all come up with individually, and then come up with a group consensus as to which approaches you feel are going to be more suitable to address the issues you've identified in part 1. It's important to make that link between part 3 and part 1. Part 1, you're identifying all the issues that are concerning the scenario. Part 3, you really need to make sure your approaches, your new practices, your technology and partnerships address those issues. If you don't, you kind of miss that connection between the two. Part 4 is your reflection. This is completely different for every single person's. Okay, so, and the only person that sees this is yourself and your ELA. You don't email this to the rest of your team. You just include this in your individual submission. Part 5 is your reference list. The first list should be the team reference list, which is all the references you use for part 1 and 3. And then underneath that, you have a separate heading of individual reference list, and these are the references you've used for parts 2 and 4. Lastly, your record of collaboration. This is where you're going to show us how you've worked together. So your screenshots, your overviews, however you're going to choose to put it all together. Okay. It is really, really important with this task. As Nairi was mentioning, if you are splitting the task up and getting different team members to answer certain parts and put 150 words together, make sure it's cohesive. We want to see that analysis is really concise, it's really succinct, it really links together, so we don't want to see where one person has started and the next person starts and how it's broken down. We really want to see that it is a cohesive response. So if you are going to break that part of the task down and get different people to do a certain word limit, that's a great idea, but make sure you then spend time at the end editing it and making sure it all flows. Okay. And the template, really, it is a godsend. It just makes life so much easier for you if you have a look at your the template that we've given you, because it goes through each part. If there are parts missing, that is going to impact your result. So please make sure that you complete all components of this task. Okay, so every single person submits one Word document each, and in that it will contain all your team components as well as your individual components. And please make sure you have a title page. I know lots of people didn't include a title page for the essays, but it is crucial for this because it just identifies all your team members. Okay, I'll answer a few more questions in a tick, really conscious of time. The next slides are really quick though. Please make sure you check the rubric. This is what we use to mark your work. It is a holistic rubric, so it means you need to complete all of the dot points So all the different criteria at the pass level to be able to then move on to a credit, distinction or HD. So if there are parts missing, you will struggle to get out of that pass mark. You might even struggle to pass it all. So we need to make sure as a team, you've got someone in the team who's going through the rubric and checking and making sure you've addressed everything. Because if you don't, you'll really struggle to move to those higher levels that I know that you're all aiming for. Okay. Generally, each team member is going to receive similar marks because you're all getting similar marks for the team components, but there will be some variations because each of the individual components, there's going to be variation in those responses. Okay, so that's important for you to know. Last couple of slides very quickly. Okay, lots of additional resources, the referencing guide. You can submit your work to your tutor should you choose to, and you know, some of you might find that really useful. The teamwork support that we've offered on the discussion board, the reflective writing guide that Nairi was focusing on. There's lots of information in the assignment too, information on our discussion boards and also in the assessment details. Please, 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 if you've still got questions, make sure you come back to the discussion boards and post them in the group, the main question and answer forum on your discussion board, because lots of you are coming up with similar questions. If you post them in your thread, your ELA might not get to them as quickly as if they're in the assignment 2 Q&A forum, okay? And at the very last resort, email your ELA if you're finding that your question's been overlooked, because we're finding there's lots of questions happening at the moment. Moving on very quickly, this is the final slide, so thank you for hanging on past the 1 hour. If you need a 48-hour extension because something's popped up, please make sure you email your ELA as soon as you possibly can, and then we can let you know whether we're going to be able to grant you an extension or not. The longer than 48-hour extensions, as Beck mentioned in the Flips Collaborate, it's fairly uncommon for this final assessment for her to grant extensions longer than 48 hours unless there are extreme circumstances. Now, extreme circumstances do pop up, life happens, but please make sure you get on to contacting Beck or your ELA as soon as you possibly can, so that something can be put in place, because we do have deadlines to complete marking your assessments and getting all of your grades finalised in our grade books so that the unit can be finished and finalised. So yeah, please make sure you get onto that as soon as possible. I think, any questions? Did any of the other ELAs have any questions that popped up? Let me have a look, I'll just scroll through. Where are we? I think the most important thing with this task is to really consider what you've learnt from the unit and to apply that to this scenario. If we can start to see that you're applying those main ideas, then you've got it, you've smashed it out. Okay, I think given that the timeline is fairly short now between today and handing your final assessment in, you're really going to have to motor as a team to get through some of the tasks, especially if you haven't completed part 2. So I would suggest getting on to part 1, looking at all those issues. We've got some great resources we're going to share on the discussion board in terms of our screenshots to give you some guidance with your thinking. Put your ideas for part 1 down and get that sorted fairly quickly. Move off onto your part 2 and make sure you communicate which new practices you're going to talk about, which technology you're going to focus on, and which internal and external partnerships you're going to consider with your approach, and communicate that to other team members. As Alex said, if you all focus on the same things, your analysis and your comparison is going to be pretty minimal. So that is going to reduce your ability to achieve at a high level for that section of the task. So make sure you've got a good range of ideas, and then in part 3, really critically analyse how effective each of those strategies are going to be in terms of addressing the issues you've identified. Okay, you might find in part 1 there's a lot to discuss. So maybe choose the most important elements that you feel are crucial from the issue. By all means, go through and sort of almost list, but not list, the main ones, and then choose a few to focus on, because I think 600 words is going to be challenging to mention everything and go into all the detail that you need. Okay, so maybe choose the ones that as a team you feel are the most important to focus on, and maybe go back and revisit part 1 once you've got part 3 in your heads. So you've done your analysis, and then think about how they're linked and make those connections, and maybe go back to part 1 and tweak it a little bit. If you haven't addressed a particular issue, maybe move it down your list a little, and maybe not elaborate so much on that and focus on ones that will elaborate. Because as ELAs, we want to see you've addressed those issues from part 1 in part 3. Are there any other questions? 7:15, that's pretty good. Yeah, Christine, thank you. We have made that as a suggestion as well as ELAs, because we were lucky that Beck got the flipped collab out as early as she could, but we also feel the same. We feel that it could have been a bit earlier, just to give you a bit more time to get through some of the tasks. You still have tons of time though. When you think about it, the task isn't huge. It's just getting together and making sure you complete all those components together. Okay, so give yourselves deadlines, work to those deadlines. If you can't meet the deadline, communicate that with each other. And if you are having any trouble, if someone's disappeared off your group list, please make sure you contact your ELA, and we'll send them a quick email and see if we can find out what's going on, because things do happen. And people do have to leave the unit, or they do have things pop up that interrupt their participation, so we can work out a plan of action together. Please don't panic, just keep us all in the loop with what's going on. A lot of ELAs have already asked for a quick update from each of the teams, just as a quick check-in, to make sure that everything's on track, and to identify any issues that you might have come across already, or to let you know if there's a team member that hasn't made contact yet. If you're yet to do that, it'd be a great idea to let your ELA know. I know I sent an email out at the beginning of the week and asked for my teams to get back to me. So if your team's yet to do that, please get onto that ASAP, just so we know how you're travelling, because we want to make sure that everyone's okay. If there are no more questions, I might stop the recording, and then if anyone's got any last minute things, we can finalise that. Thank you so much to Kathy and to Helen and to Nairi for attending tonight and for offering their wisdom to this task for you. And thank you to everyone for turning up. I appreciate it's getting late, so I hope you all have a lovely night. I will stop the recording now as soon as it lets me.